Welcome to Ruck Around and Find Out with Justin Harris. I'm happy to be with you guys today. This is the start of a whole new adventure for me in the form of a podcast. I'd like to start by telling you my story, and then in subsequent episodes, subsequent podcasts, we'll have some guests, and sometimes it'll just be me. And hopefully you'll find it inspirational and aspirational and helpful to you. Here's the story. I was so excited when I made it to the number one spot on the waiting list for a 2023 Ducati Panigale V4 SP2. I was number one on the waiting list at Ducati Newport Beach because I knew they could get one. That bike, for those of you that don't know bikes, is basically a MotoGP bike. It's 215 horsepower or so that also has maybe, I don't know, it's less than 500 pounds wet. I had just picked that up the first part of November, and then about a week before Thanksgiving in 2022, I started a trial. That trial went for about a month. I actually finished the trial on December 23rd, 2022. The day after Christmas, I went out with my son Mason to put the rest of the break-in mileage on my bike. For those of you that don't know bikes, the break-in mileage thing is a thing, and you do it so you keep the bike under certain RPMs or speeds to kind of break in the motor. That day, we decided to do a traditional loop that we'd done many times just outside of Fresno, California. Sadly, however, as I was traveling down Road 211, which runs on the west side of Millerton Lake, coming back from O'Neill's, for those of you familiar with the area, I suddenly found myself pulled from the bike. It was really like a bungee jump, that I was essentially just kind of ripped from the bike, and I found myself going airborne at that time. I remember closing my eyes and thinking to myself, this is going to hurt. Little did I know how badly it would hurt, not as much physically, but really mentally. And I'll explain. I remember waking up essentially on the side of the road. At first, I wasn't entirely sure that I'd lost consciousness, but I learned later that I had, because my son Mason basically had to pull my bike off of me. The front tire was still spinning and basically grinding into the outside of my right thigh. That, in many respects, was the worst physical injury in terms of pain that I remember. I just remember asking Mason to take my head off, not my head off, that's kind of funny, to take my helmet off, because I hadn't had a chance yet to hook up the sort of Bluetooth wireless setup, and so I'd actually put some AirPods in and then put a head sock on, for those of you that know what that is. And then I was at the time, I was kind of listening to some like techno, and I just remember waking up on the side of the road on my back and feeling, hearing this just incessant techno music that, given my current state of physical being at the time, and frankly mental being, I wasn't feeling great. And so I just remember asking Mason to please get this helmet off of me. In hindsight, we probably shouldn't have done that, although I don't think it really caused any more harm. We saw the highway patrol, and thankfully for us, the highway patrol was only maybe, I don't know, 3 to 5 miles away over on Highway 41. That's the road that heads to Yosemite. Once the highway patrol arrived, or actually before the highway patrol arrived, it was like the weirdest thing. And I had to confirm with Mason later that this was something that had actually happened, because I wasn't sure if I was hallucinating, because I remember being pretty out of it. I remember this was right around dusk when the accident occurred, and I remember seeing headlights as I was lying in the road for, basically oncoming traffic. And at that time, I remember that this lady stopped her vehicle. I remember seeing her headlights, and she stopped her vehicle maybe, I don't know, 50 feet away, and then came up, and she could see me laying there, and she asked, "Are you a believer?" And I remember at that time that this was not a time, though I am a believer, this was not a time to necessarily debate religion with her. Rather, I simply said yes, and she said, "May I pray for you?" And I remember getting very emotional at the time and thinking, who is this guardian angel that would show up out of nowhere? And I don't really remember what happened to her after she prayed over me. She basically left, and shortly thereafter, the Highway Patrol showed up. I find it interesting that the Highway Patrol seemed unnecessarily preoccupied with asking me to present my license and insurance information to him. Of course, he didn't know about the extent of my injuries at the time, but I just found it interesting that that seemed to be his focus. Regardless, I went first by ambulance to a local hospital. One of the hardest things I did, though, before I went to that hospital, actually, is that I said, "Mason, you need to call Mom. You need to let her know that I've been in an accident." And that was one of the hardest things, frankly, that at that point in time I had to do, because I really didn't know the extent of my injuries. I largely thought I was probably going to be okay, although I remember that both of my hands were incredibly swollen, especially my right hand. And so Colette, my wife, actually that's Mrs. Judicious Nomad, she was on the phone, and Mason got instructions from her of which hospital to take me to. In fact, I remember that she apparently asked Mason, "Hey, I can just come and meet you guys," at which point Mason had the undesirable task of explaining to her that that was not something that was possible because of my injuries. So after that, I went to a local hospital, and that was one of the scarier moments of my life, if I'm being honest. Not that I hadn't been to a hospital before, because I had, although this was my first trip in an ambulance. I remember they gave me some kind of a happy juice cocktail on the way to probably minimize the pain. And I remember they also had to cut off my tobacco motorwear jacket because you couldn't get my right hand through my jacket. More on that later. So I ended up at the hospital, and actually the sweet people that were with the ambulance company, because my wife beat us there, they said to her, "Hey, just kind of like tuck in behind us, and we'll see if we can smuggle you in." But sadly, she was stopped by the charge nurse before she could actually go in. They sent me to get CT scans over pretty much all of my body. And then I remember that they brought me back to the ER. And in the ER, at first, they had to basically relocate or reset my right thumb. Turns out I tore the ligament that connects my right thumb to my hand. The only thing keeping my thumb connected, in fact, was swelling. And they really struggled to get that back into the socket because it kept popping out. And then I also broke the little finger on my left hand in 2 places. Other than that, I had terrible abrasions. Of course, this would be the one day when I was out riding, when though I had, a Kevlar jacket that I actually got for Christmas, a Kevlar line jacket by Tobacco Motorwear. And but then sadly, I wasn't terribly bright and just wore regular jeans, which to those of you who ride, don't ever be dumb like that. Don't do that. I can tell you from experience, it's incredibly painful especially when you fly through the air and land on asphalt. The most disturbing part, however, of the CT scan process was when one of the doctors came into the ER which, as you know, is kind of a wild and crazy place, and then told me that, in fact, I had an active brain bleed and that they needed to transfer me to a different hospital which had a higher level of trauma care. I remember that moment that it was almost as if it was like I felt like I was going to pass out or something. I just felt like at that moment that it was like I got this sort of tunnel vision, and I just felt my whole life was over in that moment. I remember also that before they transferred me, I basically begged the charge nurse. Well, first, they also made me kind of call my wife on my phone. Excuse me. And then I told her, hey, or they told her that I had this brain bleed and I was going to need to be transferred. She and my son Mason were in the lobby in the waiting area for the ER at that point. I remember basically begging the charge nurse at this first hospital to allow me to see both of them, because at first, because they were still observing this essential kind of COVID protocol, which I thought was nonsense. I still think it was nonsense. But at that point, I basically begged them, I need to see both my wife and my son. And I remember being very emotional at the time and saying, please let me see my son in particular, because I want him to see me alive. I wasn't convinced that I was necessarily going to make it much longer because of the brain bleed. I didn't know the extent of it. I didn't have a good understanding of what that meant, other than it seemed like something that from which I was probably going to die, or I was convinced I would. And gratefully, out of the goodness of her heart, the charge nurse allowed both my wife, Colette, and Mason to come back and see me, albeit for just a few minutes. I then got transferred to the second hospital, which I will tell you was a horrible experience. At the second hospital, at no time did they actually perform an MRI. They basically did nothing as far as I was concerned, other than tried to keep me alive. They put me in a hallway where I was on a hospital gurney of sorts, adjacent to, fairly close to, individuals who were handcuffed to their gurneys. This was basically a downtown trauma hospital. And frankly, I was terrified. I felt unable to protect myself. I remember that they basically put me in the hallway. I was there all night, scared to death. And in fact, there's a video that I posted on my Judicious Nomad page on Instagram of a video that I sent to my wife from the hospital, telling her I was going to be okay, which I'm telling you, at that time I was totally lying, because I did not believe I was going to be okay, but I wanted her to see this video of me. In the middle of the night, they came to me and they visited me, and these were, I think, some people doing orthopedic rounds, some residents and some doctor, and presumably an orthopedist or an orthopedic surgeon, and they basically splinted my right hand, told me that it would probably resolve by itself, which, for lack of a better term, suggests to me that they were totally inept, because I had already severed or ruptured the ligament connecting my right thumb to my right hand. And they basically buddy taped my left little finger to my left fourth finger. And I remember at about probably 6:30 in the morning, 6 or 6:30 in the morning the next day, that a person came in to give me some cognitive testing. And that was, I think, largely just so they could discharge me. And I was able to pass that with flying colors, although she noted some aggression on my part, partly because I thought the tests were dumb. tend to have a nearly eidetic memory, and thankfully that's one thing that I never lost, apart from the brief period that I was unconscious. About 12:30 or 1 o'clock the next day, they took me, or they discharged me from the hospital. And wouldn't you know it, my discharge instructions, which if you want a copy, I'll show them to you, reflect no sort of concussion or brain bleed protocol. It's as if it never happened. I think it said nothing. It was like I literally didn't experience this traumatic brain injury, but rather they simply discharged me, which I believe was professional negligence at a minimum. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a trial lawyer, but it was incompetence of the highest order. That started the next phase of my journey, which frankly was pretty brutal. One of the good things that happened for me is I had 3 different surgeries. Two surgeries related to my thumb. In the first surgery, they put a post in there to kind of stabilize the joint, and they also reattached the ligament with a titanium anchor. And then after about 6 weeks, they took that post out. And then I had a surgery on my left hand where they placed 2 screws to basically stabilize that bone break and help that to heal. I then spent about the next 5 to 6 months preoccupied with my physical therapy. During this period, I was already experiencing debilitating headaches. And because I didn't have any kind of concussion protocol, I didn't know things such as that I should not be, spending a lot of time in front of a screen, which I tend to do as a lawyer. And I was basically at work the day after I got released from the hospital. Part of that's because I own my own firm, but I had no idea of anything that I was supposed to do. I think a run-of-the-mill high school student, high school football player who suffered a concussion would have received better care and guidance than I did from the trauma hospital where they sent me. After about 5 or 6 months, I was ready to sort of finish my physical therapy, which I was doing about 3 days a week, to try and regain the flexibility and mobility in my right thumb in particular. The little finger on my left hand was much easier to rehab. And I think because of that, I wasn't as focused on some of the things that were going on in my head. So for example, I think I was basically distracted, and that was a good thing. But then about May or June of 2023, 2 things seemed to happen in tandem. First, I was served with a lawsuit for about $7.5 million against me. And then at the same time, I developed what's known as post-concussion syndrome. Post-concussion syndrome has all kinds of fun side effects, which include things like depression, suicidal ideation, debilitating headaches, brain fog, and you generally feel terrible. I remember at the time that I had a relative that was able to who's a doctor, that was able to sort of walk me and Colette through this process of post-concussion syndrome, and I really credit him with effectively diagnosing what I had. I didn't even see my first neurologist until probably almost a year after my accident. And I also didn't even get an MRI until about a year after my accident. Of course, by then it would have been difficult to tell what was really going on. But let me talk to you about some of the terrible effects of having post-concussion syndrome and what it was like for me. Everybody's experience may be a little bit different, but I can tell you that for me, it was basically a living hell. My days went something like this. I could hardly get myself out of bed in the morning. It was brutal. I woke up every day convinced I was going to take my own life that day. The depression was so terrible and the suicidal ideation was so terrible that it really made it almost impossible to function. But by the grace of God, I had a sweet wife in Colette who would literally pull me out of bed in the morning, would then basically push me into the shower, get me, cleaned up, get me out the door to the office, and then once I got to the office, I would sort of magically be able to slip into my comfort zone, if you will. In fact, I never felt incompetent to practice. I just felt like it was harder to do, that I had to work harder than I'd ever had to work before to just perform the basic functions of my job. And so that whole process went on. It was like rinse and repeat. It was like the worst form of Groundhog Day without any good humor that went on for more than a year. It was like that every single day. I am proud that I never took any steps, never actually planned to take my own life. So I was able to kind of buffet those various dark thoughts and kind of keep them in check. And one of the things that we'll talk about is how I manage some of those things. I eventually, though, linked up with a fantastic neurologist in San Francisco at UCSF in about March or April of 2024. And that's when I feel like a lot of my healing actually really began. I was able to get some medication that was able to control my headaches, and which is really for me the form of a kind of once-a-month injection that I'm able to self-administer. And I was also able to get some great therapy and some great guidance from people I know cared about me. Colette cared about me the whole time, and as far as I'm concerned, she's the one who should really be given sort of an honorary medical degree for going through this whole process with me. And she hung in there with me. And so then in about September of 2024, I decided that I was going to start Judicious Nomad, which is my public profile on Instagram and Facebook. And through Judicious Nomad, what I started doing was I started rucking. I actually started rucking with a 20-pound pack that was like one of those Amazon deals that you can buy for not a lot of money that I think is filled with sand. And I started rucking and recording a reel every single day. Today was day 518. I have never missed a single day of rucking in 518 days. I then went where I was using what used to be the Ruck Training Weight Vest 2.0 or Weight Training Vest 2.0, where I started rucking. I went from 20 to 40 pounds. And then really this last fall, I switched to the Rucker 4.0, still with the 40 pounds. That's been the best thing ever that I've done. Originally, it kind of started off as sort of a video log for me as an external processor. And let me say a little bit about external processors. I think it's important that one do external processing, or I should say I happen to be one, versus being an internal processor. So the great thing as an external processor is that means as hard as it is, I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking. And one of the great benefits of being an external processor is I basically used the Judicious Nomad platform and the reels that I recorded to process different things I was dealing with. Some of those reels are pretty raw, pretty hard to listen to, particularly for those who care about me. But I wanted to give back in some way to help people who are contemplating permanent decisions to not make permanent decisions for what are really temporary problems. And so that's going to be the mission of this podcast. I'm going to talk to, sometimes I'll talk to some great people who have overcome some very hard things. They don't necessarily have to be anybody famous. They can be regular people who struggle with hard things. And that's what I hope to do through this. I'll also have some where I'll just kind of tell you about some of the strategies that I implemented, some of the ways that I was able to keep going day after day. I'm so very grateful for all the people that stuck behind me, that stayed with me, and especially to my sweet wife and all of my children, and now my little grandchildren, and my granddaughter Ellie gets a special shout out because I hope that she'll maybe listen to this one day. And so that's going to be the way things are going to go. We're going to have different guests on. I'll talk to you sometimes. And the goal is to inspire and help you know and help you learn, to the extent that you are struggling in any respect, that quitting, that giving up is not the solution. That when things get hard, it's important that we learn to overcome those hard things by, frankly, just keep rucking. That's what I've done, and I plan to keep doing it until maybe someday if I forget about it or if you forget about me. And that, my friends, is the first episode of this podcast.